Well, welcome all. My name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace, which we call CMEP for short. I'm thrilled that you're joining us. I've been waiting for this webinar for about a year since our last class of Ambassador Warren Clark Fellows joined us. And this is Tala Al-Raheb's last week as an Ambassador Warren Clark Fellow and her last event after having accomplished great things with us in the past year. And Jennifer Madrand was an Ambassador Warren Clark Fellow. She's now on staff with us as our manager of outreach, including church partnerships. And then Kevin Volrath is our manager of Middle East partnerships, coming to us from Bethlehem. And he also was an Ambassador Warren Clark Fellow. And then we also have Ben joining us, Ben Norquist, who works with me as a fellow and a research assistant who just recently finished his PhD. So lots of academic conversations ahead. This conversation will take just about an hour, and each of our panelists will have 10 minutes or less to summarize their PhD work. We did not include my doctoral work in this conversation, but I did want to just make a brief mention of it. My PhD is in U.S. history, focusing on the historic engagement of American Protestants in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the title of it came from an article in the Christian Century called Mischief Making in Palestine, which unfortunately American Christians often play the role of causing mischief rather than promoting good and constructive engagement towards peace. So my hope and prayer as we engage in academics and in our work at CMEP is that we're not mischief makers in Palestine, but that actually our work will contribute towards justice, towards human rights, towards equality, towards the sustainability of the church in the Middle East. So I'll introduce each of the panelists right before they go. Jennifer, we're going to start with you, and I'd love to introduce you to Jennifer Madrand. As I mentioned, she's the outreach manager for us at CMEP. She's a PhD candidate in Bible and cultures at Drew University. Her research explores how interpretations of the Promised Land and biblical archaeology have shaped the contemporary landscape of Palestine, Israel, and its geopolitics, and how biblical greenwashing of the land continues to play a role in the settler colonization and annexation of Palestine. I certainly hope in your introduction, Jennifer, you'll talk to us about what greenwashing is for those who might not know. But as Jennifer starts and summarizes her research, do please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who's here. I'd imagine we have some other academics who are a part of this conversation in the audience. So please say hello, and we'll use the chat for questions later on as well. But Jennifer, please go ahead and get us started.
Thank you so much for that introduction, May. It's such a really honor to be here sharing some of my research alongside some excellent and amazing scholars. So just grateful to be a part of this. As I share a little bit about my research and PhD project, I am going to share some slides with you all just to give a few images and a little bit of text to guide my way through today. So I'm starting out by sharing one of the central questions that drives my research project. And that question is, can we separate the biblical land of promise and occupation from that of contemporary Israel and Palestine? So all throughout my research is a theme and more of a question of how land and text get fused together, the text being that of the Bible and the land being that of contemporary Palestine and Israel. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of how I get at that question and how I parse that relationship in my research. So I have a little bit of a description here. Sometimes it's helpful for folks to see words as opposed to just hearing someone talk about them. So I'll just share a little bit here. My research explores the intersections of promised land, archaeology, and how those narratives are fused with the land for geopolitical means. As May mentioned, I'm working with concepts such as scripturalization and greenwashing. Scripturalization is a notion where scriptures are used to create realities outside of the world of the text. This is borrowed from a scholar named Vincent Wimbush, who writes extensively on this subject. And I'm kind of playing with that term alongside that of greenwashing. Greenwashing is the idea that certain products or places or things are kind of framed within ecological or environmental language to make them seem healthy, green, ultimately good, and that kind of layer of greenness or environmentalism often cloaks what's beneath that. So I'm going to talk about how holy places that are often archaeological sites are preserved in terms of biblical history, but are also kind of presented as these green spaces for the common good, when actually they play a role in land annexation and the erasure of the multiple histories of the land. So where I start in my research is with a few very common biblical texts, and really start in Genesis, dealing with some popular interpretations of this notion of promised land, which I like to say constructed notion of promised land. There is not one idea of promised land in the Bible. There actually is not the notion or phrase as we think of it. And so I start with the multiple images of what we often think is just one image of promised land. And so I think it's very important to highlight the ways in which the Bible has a lot of different ideas about the land, and the ways in which there has never been just one narrative about who inhabits the land or how their relationship to the land ought to be. So I like to remind when I'm in conversation with people or doing a Bible study, I think it's really helpful for us to remember that God says a lot of different things about the land of Canaan, that no one owns the land, that dwelling on it is contingent and involves covenant with God, that God threatens to vomit people out of the land, and that there are multiple narratives around how the land is conquered, sometimes all at once, sometimes not at all. So just highlighting here some of the texture that we see in biblical texts related to the land that often don't kind of make their way to the surface in contemporary narratives that kind of draw lines of connection between the Bible and the contemporary landscape. After biblical texts, I move to look at some of the early kind of Western archaeological interactions with Palestine that were happening in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this the kind of framework of Orientalism through which Western scholars and even political leaders often referred to the land, understanding Palestine as a land of the Bible, but also one that Western Christians had some sort of stake in or ownership of through their biblical interpretation and through eventually their sort of participation in excavating and re-narrating the land. So I just highlight that here because I think some of these foundations and frameworks shape a method of interpretation wherein oftentimes those of us in the Western world interpret ourselves into the biblical text that we read and see us as part of that story in a way, oftentimes reading ourselves as those who are promised, or those in our spheres as those who live on the side of God's promises and that always means that there are others then who live on the other side of that promise. I then just want to highlight, and in my research, I kind of explored pretty extensively the Ordnance Survey of Western Palestine, which was a project in the late 1800s by the British Empire that sought to recover the land of the Bible and map it out. And this was one of the first really important maps that sought to conceptualize biblical stories in cartographical form, in the form of a map. And this later became the guide for biblical archaeologists. It became the guide for European settlers, and it also became a guide for the British Empire when they took control of Palestine. So the fusion of land and text is one that I argue has been around even before this, but this is certainly a very significant moment in that history. I'm going to jump here just a little bit and just kind of explain that a big chunk of my work is working with the evolution of biblical archaeology in Palestine and the ways in which biblical archaeology has always been intertwined with political motives, with preconceived notions about biblical texts and their historicity or their truths. And so I rely heavily on the work of Palestinian anthropologist Nadia Abu al-Hajj, who talks about archaeologists carving particular kinds of objects out of the ground, and in doing so, carving the land into a particular narrative. And so she talks about the creation of facts on the ground, that archaeology actually participates in re-narrating the land, or in telling its story in a very particular way. So in my research, I take a look at a few key archaeological sites in the land where this has happened historically, and touch on the ways in which, a lot of important sites are used in a number of ways. They're often used in politically strategic areas. The site of Megiddo was used to secure a stronghold of land during the British occupation of Palestine. And there are several other sites that were kind of strategically excavated and invested in because of their important location. In addition to that, archaeological sites are often curated as biblical historical sites and national parks. And this can appeal to folks of a variety of faiths and to secular Israelis and tourists as well. So in the last part of my dissertation, I have a case study of sorts on the city of David, which is an archaeological site wherein there are ongoing efforts in East Jerusalem to not only build up this biblical historical site, but really to revamp it as a site of a biblical theme park of sorts. And so this space is protected in a number of ways as a historical site, as a national park, and is growing in politically strategic areas along the Green Line and in Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem that are very vulnerable. So I'll end here with the same slide that I started with. I hope that I haven't taken you too quickly through the journey of my research, but again, to say, I kind of am doing work throughout history, but yet find that this question of what is the relationship between land and text, and can we separate them, very, very important if we're to understand what's happening in East Jerusalem or what's happening in the land more broadly when it comes to land annexation and the role that the Bible plays in that. So thank you. Looking forward to the conversation with everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I know you went so quickly through that. I feel like we could have had a webinar all just about your dissertation. I'm teaching a course right now for Pacific Rim in Hawaii, a Christian college there, on the minor prophets. And a lot of the themes you were talking about in terms of the biblical text and land and conditions of faithfulness of the covenant, which result either in judgment or restoration, are very, very present throughout the Hebrew scriptures. I do want to encourage people, we will have a brief time for question and answer, but if you have specific questions for Jennifer, use that Q&A function. And while we're presenting, we can have a conversation in the chat and via Q&A as well. I'm very excited to introduce you to our second speaker, Dr. Ben Norquist, a research assistant to me. He received his PhD just recently in higher education from Azusa Pacific University. His dissertation is entitled "In the Land of Our Birth, a regional case study of higher education, settler colonial space, and epistemological resistance in Palestinian Bethlehem." He's currently extending his research to explore the legal and regulatory regimes within which Palestinian colleges and universities operate. And Ben, I don't know a lot about your research, so I'm actually really excited to hear. So please.
Thank you. Thank you, May. And thanks everyone for giving us a little slice of your time to listen. It's an honor, and after spending years on a project, wondering if people will pay attention to it, it's reassuring to have people pay attention to it. I'd like to extend a happy Scarf Day to everyone. I don't know if you knew this, but it's National Scarf Day today. And here in the western suburbs of Chicago, where I live, it's an appropriate day. It's a little chilly out. And so happy Scarf Day. I also wanted to acknowledge, before I jump into my dissertation project, that my home and where I'm sitting right now is on the traditional homeland of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa, indigenous peoples here in America. And acknowledging that is actually it's connected in my mind to some of the themes that I worked on in this dissertation as well, particularly around settler colonialism, because as a US citizen who has roots in Europe, I benefit from the settlement of the United States as well. I think of myself as a son of the settlement of the United States, and so some of these themes are important to me as I kind of unpack what that means, particularly in light of my faith as a follower of Jesus. Okay, so I do not have slides. I hope that I'm able to kind of use words to unpack and make some of the ideas that I'm working with clear enough. And then maybe if you have questions, I can take a second stab at clarity during the Q&A. I think of myself as a social researcher of education. So with a little bit less interest, particularly in sort of the practical technique questions of teaching and learning, and with more interest in the ways that education is shaped by its social context and then shapes its social context in return in a kind of mutual relationship. So the case study that I'm going to share a little bit about here, I took 3 years on, and it's a study of higher education, the higher education system in the Palestinian town of Bethlehem, which is in the occupied West Bank. And some of the questions that I was asking relate to how faculty and administrators perceive their students and the kinds of challenges that their students face. Question, I was curious about how faculty and administrators at colleges in Bethlehem, what they do, and how they perceive their own efforts as educators and administrators. I was interested in the challenges, the larger challenges surrounding students and educators as they go about their work, their tasks, pursuing their aspirations as educators and learners. what are the challenges that they run into as they go about that? And then how do they respond to those challenges? I am particularly, sort of stepping away from this project, I'm particularly interested in how the ways that societies organize space, physical space, has implications for knowledge and knowledge production and knowledge transfer and teaching, educational enterprises. What is the implication of various infrastructures that lay over the top of space, of zones and bureaucracies that organize space and create zones where people are contained and where they can sometimes move in and out of those containers or not. And then the implications of those spatial regimes for social processes of knowledge production, knowledge transfer, knowledge keeping, and education. Those themes are, when you think about those themes and then think about the West Bank is highly controlled in its spaces and highly organized in how people are able or not able to move around within the West Bank and in and out of the West Bank. That was a very helpful case for thinking about some of those themes. And a challenging case and complex in so many ways, but also inspiring too. I used a case study method to explore some of these questions, which basically just means that a case study allows you to study a complex entity or thing in depth, drawing it with high resolution, drawing in attention to a lot of details and nuances and complexities in its context. So in this case, it's, the entity was the 3 colleges and the people who are a part of those colleges. And the context that I was most interested in was the physical infrastructures of spatial control that surround and interpenetrate that whole region, where students live in that context, faculty live in that context, administrators live in that context, and they're all participating in various ways in complex institutions that exist in that context. And so how does the context and the entity, what are the various levels of relationship between them? That's what I was thinking about. I would situate my project at the intersection of 3 different bodies of scholarship or inquiry. Palestinian studies themselves, directly sort of that whole body of literature, which is copious and rich and wonderful. And then settler colonial theory, which overlaps, but is its own field. And then higher education theory, which also overlaps, but is its own field. And so at the intersection of those 3 things, that's where I would put this study. Now, for the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to share a couple of ideas that came out clearly to me as I was conducting this project, and some of the findings that are associated with those ideas. The first idea I want to share is this idea of settler colonial machinery, which is an idea that's already in the literature. That's not my contribution, but the basic idea is that all of these components of infrastructure and regulations and laws and legal regimes are present in the West Bank, imposed upon the West Bank, but they're not separate from each other. They are they're closely related to each other, kind of like components in a machine. And the machinery is one of settler colonial transfer. So drawing in this idea of transfer, it's the settler part of settler colonialism, where in a settler colonial context, the domination of the colonial entity is not for the sake necessarily of economic extraction, as in a lot of other colonial contexts, but for the sake of transferring populations, transferring an indigenous population either physically out of the land or sociologically to the margins in order to make space for a settler population. And if that's what's true of the larger context, then it's relevant to this study of what does that mean for higher education in Palestine. So all of that is present, and there's a scholar, anthropologist out there, Jeff Halper, who has termed that idea of the matrix as the matrix of control. But what I wanted to do with the study is think through how does the matrix of, what are the implications of the matrix of control for knowledge functions in Palestinian society. And so what I argue for in the project is that that controlling bodies controls prospects for knowledge producing encounters. That this matrix of control of the separation barrier, the checkpoints, the regulations and regimes that govern where Palestinians can be and when they can be there, also has epistemological implications. It makes it harder in many ways for Palestinians to produce and transfer to new generations the same kinds of knowledge that previous generations had access to. It's not that they can't look things up on the internet, of course, and like there are certain kinds of knowledge, very cognitive, content-based kinds of knowledge that aren't necessarily affected by this way, but more tactile and human kinds of knowledge that produce emotional connections can be controlled and impacted by the limitation of where people travel. And then the other idea that I want to propose is this idea of adaptive pedagogy. And it's just simply the idea that given the challenges that are implicit in that context of control, spatial control that has knowledge producing implications, how is it that Palestinian educators and learners respond to those challenges? And so I parse this in 3 ways, and then I will be done. Across the interviews that I did with students and faculty and the focus groups, some of the things that I heard, what I think of as the aspirations that are being pursued. So, for example, it was common when I asked faculty, what are some of your aspirations for students, that they named things like integrity, that students be growing in their integrity, their commitment to kind of an ethical lifestyle, that they grow in their sense of empowerment and personal agency, that they can make a decision and apply their creativity to pursue that goal, and a variety of other things. But then I also heard about challenges. So conceptually, as educators and learners are pursuing those aspirations, these interviews revealed this strong theme of, but then they run into challenges. And the challenges were of all different kinds, including physical restrictions of where they can go. So things like checkpoints and separation wall and violence, but also more cognitive and mental health oriented things like stress and trauma and instability and some of those kinds of themes. So, and the faculty saw those kinds of challenges as obstacles to the pursuit of these aspirations. But then, and here's where this idea of adaptive pedagogy comes in, it didn't stop there. These conversations went on, and faculty and administrators started describing the ways that, and students themselves, the ways that they continue pursuing those aspirations by adapting to work around or within the kinds of limitations imposed by those challenges. And so that's what I call adaptive pedagogy or adaptive structures. And they showed up in all different parts of the institutions, like in syllabi and lesson plans, in personal commitments to mentoring and being present to students and available not just for academic conversations, but for more mentoring kinds of conversations, a commitment to ensuring that campus spaces were safe spaces, physically safe and emotionally safe spaces, and so on. So I think my time is done. I hope that I was clear enough, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ben. And I love what you're educating us about in terms of, as you talk about safe space on campuses and the role of, professors and administrators asking questions about integrity. Like, that's not what we read in the news when we read about, the Palestinian academics or Birzeit University and so I think that's a good reminder. And I look forward to learning more. I also thought it was interesting that as Ben presented and Jennifer presented, Jennifer's themes of text and land, and then Ben talking about settler colonial machinery and the resulting population transfers, that there's some common themes in terms of research. One of the things I wrote about a lot from American Christian engagement in the Holy Land was what I call theological imperialism, the way that American Christians use theology to justify some of the very things you're talking about, the confiscation of land, population transfers, which ties into your acknowledgement of being on native land. I'm in the land of the Salish people, the Lummi indigenous community here in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the themes that's very present as we look at the history of Israel-Palestine is this idea of terra nullius, this idea that if the land is not cultivated in a Western way, then it's justified for the land to be confiscated, which is actually even present today in laws that are applied in the West Bank and in the occupied Palestinian territories. So thank you for that. We have two more presenters. The next presenter is Tala Raheb. And I want to just say a minute, Tala is an Ambassador Warren Clark Fellow, and we started this fellowship shortly after I became the executive director. It's named after my predecessor, Ambassador Warren Clark, who was a foreign service officer, who was an ambassador in a couple of different countries for the United States. And our goal was to bring to CMEP the opportunity for young and developing scholars, PhD candidates, to engage with our work. CMEP is a coalition of 34 member communions, and part of our denominational engagement is the idea that we can play the role as a Christian think tank engaging in peace building in the Middle East. And so I've been so grateful for our scholars and so grateful for our fellows, of which Tala is one for just a couple more days. She's a PhD candidate at Emory University in West and South Asian religions, and her research examines Palestinian American encounters with Christian Zionism at the intersection of American religion and politics, and examines how this encounter impacts the American church and American religious life. So Tala, we'd love to hear a bit about what you're researching in your own PhD studies.
Thank you, May. I just want to start by saying how grateful I am to be part of this conversation with awesome colleagues, and also seeing as this is my last event for CMEP, I really just want to give a shout out to the CMEP team and say just how thankful I am to have been a fellow with you all this past year. I'm going to share slides as well, and just so I can, I hope everyone can see.
Yep, we can see it.
Thank you. So if you have been following the news the last couple of months to a year, or if you have signed up to receive the CMEP bulletin, and if not, you should, you may have noticed global outrage over what has been happening in Palestine, whether it be the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Israeli assault on Gaza in August, or the displacement of Palestinians from towns and villages. Marches erupted all over the world in support of Palestinian rights. In the US, these marches have occurred sporadically in the last decade. What was unprecedented, however, is that Palestinians in the diaspora took to the streets in large numbers to protest the Israeli occupation. And so from New York to California and across the US, Palestinian Americans demonstrated against Israeli policies, showing that Palestinian Americans were not passive citizens, but were ready to contribute to the political conversation in the US. And now, while the proliferation of social media has placed Palestinian American activism in the spotlight, their contributions to US foreign policies and advocacy for Palestinian rights are actually rooted in grassroots activism that was started by early Palestinian immigrants. And so, upon migration, Palestinian immigrants usually encountered Christian and political Zionism and pushed back against Zionist theologies and US policies in various ways. And so, as May mentioned, my research examines historical and present day Palestinian American encounters with Christian Zionism and investigates the effects of those encounters on American religious life. And so I am right now in the middle of research and writing my dissertation. And so I will not be revealing my findings today, but I do want to share a part of my research that is foundational to my dissertation. And so I will be giving a brief history of Arab and Palestinian migration to the US, focusing specifically on Palestinian Christians because of my time limit today. And then I will also highlight the ways that Palestinian Americans play a role in advocating for Palestinian rights. And so the story of migration, many people believe that Arab migration is a recent phenomenon, but actually the story started or can be traced to the mid to late 1800s when sea travel became more accessible. And so Arab peddlers would travel by steamship, bringing Holy Land goods to the US. And the first wave of Arab immigrants to the US actually consisted of a male majority, but Arab women constituted 32% of total immigrants, a number that was actually uncommon among other immigrant groups at that time. And according, as you can see the numbers on this screen, to the US Immigration Commission, between 1899 and 1910, about 57,000 Arabs entered the country. And by 1931, the number of Arab immigrants had reached 140,000. Among those migrants were the first Palestinian Christians to America. And I just want to make a quick note about the picture, the lower picture here that says Little Syria. It mentions Christian Syrians, and actually Arabs at that time who migrated from Greater Syria, which referred to Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, were referred to as Syrians. So it was an all-encompassing term. Despite the high numbers of Palestinian immigrants in the US, the transition into the diaspora was not smooth. For many Americans, the term Arab often held negative connotations. And so Palestinians, like other immigrants, had to figure out where they belonged within American society. While speaking Arabic helped them find a community among the Arab diaspora, they still had to figure out where they stood on the racial line in an American context where one was either white, or which meant Caucasian, or non-white. And so although Arab migrants were usually considered Caucasian, they were still the victims of racial violence. And so in order to avoid that and to acquire citizenship as members of the white community, Arab migrants appealed to their Christianity and to their economic success to fit in. And many scholars have actually debated what that transition looked like for many Arabs. Some argued that when Palestinians migrated, they assimilated into American culture easily because of the similarities in values between them and white Americans. Others pushed back against these conclusions and argued that while the law said Arabs were white, their claim to whiteness did not actually translate into American cultural notions of whiteness, and that Arabs were actually considered non-Caucasian by white Europeans. And so Nonetheless, regardless of whether, there was a full or partial assimilation, my research really focuses on the fact that the events that were occurring in the Middle East at the time, particularly in Palestine, mandated that Arab migrants become more involved in US politics. And so these events, I'm just going to highlight them quickly because of the time limit, but I know that many of us are familiar with this history, and so I'll mention each one briefly. These events were happening in Palestine, and they impacted the Palestinian engagement with American politics. So first, in 1917, we have Arthur Balfour, the Prime Minister of the UK, wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild declaring Palestine a national home for the Jews without any acknowledgement of Palestinian right for self-determination. This move by the British was obviously part of a larger imperial plan for Palestine, where they hoped to establish a British colony. The second event I want to highlight is 1947. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution partitioning Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state, with Jerusalem as a separate international city that would be shared by both. Third, in 1948, a Nakba, or catastrophe, happened when thousands of Palestinians were expelled and displaced from their homes, and David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of the State of Israel. And finally, the War of 67 and Naksa, or some call it Arab-Israeli War or the Six-Day War, where more Palestinians were killed and displaced. And so all of these events led to the displacement of many Palestinians. And in terms of numbers and statistics, I'm going to quickly share numbers of the Christians that were displaced. So prior to 1948, there were 135,000 Christians living in Palestine, which constituted about 8% of the population. During a Nakba, 38% of these Palestinian Christians were displaced, causing them to lose their jobs, homes, and other properties. And so the Nakba actually led to a decrease in the percentage of Christians in Palestine from 8% to 2.8% within just a few months. And since then, Palestinian Christians have continued to leave in significant numbers. And so it's actually estimated that in 2025, Christians in Palestine will only constitute 1% of the population. And so following the Balfour Declaration, the rapid loss of land and the displacement of Palestinians in the US took it upon themselves to advocate for Palestinian rights. And so since actually the early 20th century, Palestinian Americans have formed and contributed to various societies and institutes that work for peace in the Middle East, as well as organizations that aim to preserve Palestinian identity in the diaspora. A few examples include the Institute of Arab American Affairs, Arab Cultural Center, General Union of Palestinian Students, Palestinian American Women's Association, and Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Also, through technological advancements, Palestinians born in the US have actually been able to form transnational ties and preserve their Palestinian Christian identity. For instance, online platforms have been created by Palestinian American Christians to gain Christian global support for Palestine. Their websites function as platforms that aim to bring awareness to the plight of Christians in Palestine through publishing news articles and speeches by Palestinian priests mainly. They also comment on American politics in relation to Palestinian Christians. This commitment to Palestine is not only seen among Palestinian American individuals, but actually has been taken up by churches in the US. And so a lot of Arab churches and Palestinian churches in America have started utilizing these websites to show where the church stands and to critique Western policies on the Palestine issue. And so I wanted to highlight this today because understanding the role that Palestinians play in the political and cultural life of the US constitutes an important part of US history. And to know this history is to realize that the Palestine issue has always been a part of the US political scene, and that Palestinians have always and have continued to be active citizens, maintaining hope that peace and justice are possible. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tala. I feel like we could talk about each of your projects, for an hour individually. You do have a question in the question and answer function, and I hope we have a few minutes. We'll go until about 10:10, so we'll go just over an hour. I want to have the opportunity for Kevin to be able to present, and then questions and discussion a bit amongst our panelists. So thank you for that, Tala. And our last panelist is Kevin Volrath. He is formerly an Ambassador Warren Clark Fellow, and for the past year has been working as our Manager of Middle East Partnerships based in the Bethlehem area. He's a PhD candidate at Princeton Theological Seminary, and his research focuses on Palestinian experiences of disability under Israeli occupation. So, Kevin, eager to hear the progress you've made and some of the summaries of your research.
Thank you, May. Just waiting for a second to get my camera on. Nicole, if you can help with that, or I'm not sure how I've lost permission to, but I will just jump in, and you will see my face and determine if it's pretty or not. Okay, here we go. Thank you, everyone. It's really a treat to be with you all and to hear more about my colleagues' research. We work together, but we don't always have these academic conversations. And so it's been really fun to hear a little more details. I will skip some of the motivations for my research and just try to tell you some of the findings and a couple of the stories and some of my theological reflections on them. And would love to hear your thoughts on them in this Q&A or any other time. I'll put my email in the chat and would love to be in touch. My research focuses on experiences of disability under occupation, focusing in Bethlehem. So to answer those questions, I've decided to focus on, I use ethnographic methods, participant observation, and some focus interviews, focus groups too. And I'm working primarily with two NGOs. One is in Ida Camp and the other is in Bethlehem proper. And I'll just tell you a little bit about each of them and one story for each of them. The center in Ida Camp is called Noor, and it's a group of women with children with disabilities who were responding to the growing number of children born with disabilities in Ida Camp and the lack of services for children, especially in Bethlehem's 3 refugee camps who have disabilities. So they came together and they realized quickly that they need to raise funds because many of the services were out of the price range of the families that were in need, especially in the refugee camps. So how did they raise funds? Well, one thing Palestinian women can be known for, not to stereotype, but delicious cooking. And they love to cook. And this group of women especially loves to share what they cook. So they started teaching cooking classes to some locals, but especially foreigners when they would come to visit the West Bank to learn how to cook Palestinian food themselves. And as a way to share a bit about their own family life in the refugee camps, and life with a child with a disability in this context. So my research originally, I was interested in why were there kind of suddenly more and more children being born with disabilities in this area, and why all of a sudden did this center begin, or what kind of enabled that. And many people had told me about a potential link between tear gas exposure and disability, especially among newborns. And that is the common story. I've heard many heartbreaking stories about women being exposed to tear gas. Ida Camp has been dubbed by one study the tear gas capital of the world just a few years ago. I can share that study with anyone interested. And one thing that I found in having a lot of these very sensitive conversations is that while there isn't scientific evidence right now about tear gas and pregnancy, there's a lot that goes on along with the tear gas that can affect pregnancies. The stress of having soldiers entering your home, your neighborhood, maybe attacking you or a family member, living under the fear that this could happen at any time, and a variety of health issues that result for parents as well as children. So I won't go into a list of those as I do more in my research, but I want to share one story that relates to my theological reflections I'll share in a moment, which is how this center has really impacted the whole Ida Camp community. It was started with the intention of uplifting especially families with people with disabilities and adults with disabilities through this rehabilitation center. But as a result of providing psychological support and communal support, bringing people together along new identity lines, the whole community is being developed. So recently, women that are working with NOR, it's a women's empowerment group, mostly led by women, with some male doctors who are supporting, have started gathering together every month or so to discuss the community's needs as a whole and what they can do about them, despite variety of obstacles from from the Israeli occupation, as well as cultural challenges. But they are gathering regularly to discuss some what they can do internally to improve life for their families and the community. And several of the women have told me that 10, 15 years ago, that would have been very difficult to have that kind of trust to speak out about the challenges and to work together towards building them. So sometimes there's a conception of disability as people with disabilities as a drag on resources, to put it bluntly. And what I'm finding as I complete my research is that caring for, empowering, and people with disabilities can actually have the opposite effect of uplifting a whole community as people recognize a shared humanity and shared needs and shared opportunities. So I know there's a lot more to be said about that, but I want to move briefly, at least, to my other research site, which is a center in Bethlehem called Ma'an al-Hayat, which means Together for Life. It's a wool workshop for adults with developmental disabilities and assistants who work with them in creating wool products, nativity sets, sheep, all kinds of Christmas decorations and decorations for all seasons that they sell locally as well as abroad, made from wool that otherwise would be wasted, or that they often purchase cheaply and can develop into a variety of beautiful products. So this community meets daily and has been a way for assistants as well as core members, or shabab, the adults with developmental disabilities. Shabab is the Arabic word for young people, to realize dreams. And so I just want to share one of those dreams that is being fulfilled recently. One young man, I'll call Mahmoud for this presentation, has been involved in the community for about 8 years. And over time, this is common. People, as they get to know the community and everyone gets to know each other, gets to know their hopes, their dreams, desires for life. And in the past couple of years, this person has expressed an increasing desire to gain in fitness and to lose weight. And in just recent months, the community, the assistants, as well as core members have been talking about ways that they can pursue that goal together with Mahmoud. And then it dawned on someone that their sibling owns a gym nearby. And somebody else realized that, oh, I drive past that gym once a week or twice a week and could take Mahmoud. So this kind of led to the opportunity for Mahmoud to join that gym and receive personal fitness training twice a week. And he loves it, and something that struck me is the way the community comes alive looking at videos of him exercising and at this gym, and the sense of pride he has looking back on what he's accomplished and how he's been able to work towards one of his dreams. And something that's striking about dreams and hope in this community that I'm finding is, this leads to my third and final point about hope in this context, is how backwards looking it is. You know, a lot of times we talk about hope as forward looking and hoping for specific things to come, like perhaps the end of the occupation, some version of Palestinian liberation, whatever, and the details of what that could look like. But what I'm finding in both of these research sites is when I ask people about hope in the context of the general political situation, people will say, there's no hope. Nothing is changing. Some, answers vary, but that's a common one. But when I ask about hope in the context of one's daily life or other pursuits that maybe aren't directly related to, say, ending the occupation, I see a lot of perseverance and a lot more willingness to talk about realizable goals and dreams. And often people will struggle to articulate the specific ways or steps that those dreams can or will be fulfilled, but will frequently refer to previous things that have gone well. Say, we don't know if for Mahmoud, I didn't know that I could join a gym, but I did it. And now for the past 2 months, I've been going regularly and loving it. And that gives him, as well as others in the community, hope that even despite not knowing the means of how such a dream could be fulfilled, to keep pursuing it and working towards it. And maybe eventually in surprising ways, it can happen. I would love to say more about that, but I'm mindful of our time and want to say one last thing about hope, which I'm finding is in having these ethnographic encounters, I've been driven to think about what hope looks like in my own life, and specifically its relationship to perseverance. As I see, many conceptions of hope, which are perhaps rightfully accused of naivety, a focus on beliefs about the future or feelings about the future. And many people don't believe that there is a bright future for Palestinians or feel that there is much good coming. Yet they continue acting as though a better future is possible. So that's why I've come to say, think of hope as an action and not just a feeling or a thought. And also backwards looking back at what has been accomplished. And personally, that led me to look at the connection in the New Testament often between perseverance and hope, especially in, for example, Romans 5, perseverance leads to character and character leads to hope. Hope doesn't have to lead to perseverance, though it might. Perseverance often leads to hope. And I look back on Jesus' ministry, his proclamation of the nearness of the kingdom of God as a way of reminding me to look back as I work forward and hope that if he can do it, we can do it too. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I think the words you just shared are relevant for all of us who are present here. Often at Churches for Middle East Peace, we talk about staying in the game when we don't see progress. I tease about recruiting and saying, come support us at Churches for Middle East Peace. We never win. And often it seems like, on the advocacy front, the steps are so small, or we get one step forward and then 3 steps back. And so your words about the Palestinian inspiration of part of what gives hope is the perseverance, I think is an encouragement for us. And people often say, how or why do you stay in the game? And I think it's a good reminder, if Palestinians and others experiencing oppression don't give up, who are we to not persevere? And so thank you. Thank you for your words in that regard. We have just about 10 minutes. I know some of you have put some question and answers in the chat. I would love to invite all of the panelists to turn your video cameras on. I have one question I'd love for at least a couple of you, if not all of you, to respond to. And it's really kind of the question of, okay, so here you're doing this research. Some of you have finished your PhDs. The others, we will pray alongside of you and you will persevere and get those dissertations done. So I'd invite those who are watching certainly to pray for each of these scholars in their own work, that they could bring the dissertations fully to fruition. But the question for you is really the question of, how does your research pertain specifically to the American church? So you have people watching and engaging and learning from you. What do you feel like the takeaways are? How then shall we live, I guess, is the question. How does the things you're learning impact the way then we as a part of the American church respond and should engage? So I don't know who wants to go first, but I'd love for each of you to say a few words about that if you'd be willing.
So very briefly, this idea that the way that our communities organize our physical spaces has implications for knowledge and for learning and for who in society meets and socializes with whom. That there are deep implications for how society gets organized physically. I think the idea that our churches could benefit by thinking not just theologically and not just in kind of ministry categories, but spatially, thinking about where their church is located, where their parishioners live, where the centers of not just the center, but the multiple centers of ministry could be as a result. But this idea of sort of pulling on a spatial lens, I think, is something that that studying this context in Palestine has really highlighted for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Others? Yeah, Kevin, please. Oh, sorry.
Kevin, were you going to go?
Kevin raise his hand.
Go ahead.
Kevin, then Tala.
Okay, I'll just share briefly. I think it's really important to learn for us in the West, to learn from our siblings in Christ from all over the world, theologically, and to learn what God may be teaching them can teach us, and how God might teach us through that. So any way to pay attention to that, I think, can only enrich us.
Okay, so I think I'm trying to answer both of your questions at the same time. And so one, I think learning about the diversity of the American church and recognizing that Arab Americans are part of the North American church and they play an important role. And I think sometimes we can, get siloed in our own communities. But one way sort of my research also hopes to contribute is to show, the American church in general, practical ways to engage. There are, Palestinian Christians, Americans living alongside us, and there are different ways that we can engage with each other to work on the same things that, we're already working on. So really, it's research, but it's also, there's a sense of practicality to my dissertation.
I love that. I love that. I don't know if many of you know, a few years ago, there's a group called In Defense of Christians that's often very conservative politically, but a lot of the supporters are Arab American Christians. And Ted Cruz was giving a presentation on the stage that was actually unilaterally pro-Israel. And the group booed him off the stage, and he couldn't understand because it was a group of Republicans. And, it was this anomaly of not understanding the role that Arab American Christians play. So that's just an anecdote that proves a bit of what you're talking about, Tala. Thank you for that. Jennifer, how about you?
Yeah, I can share briefly. Some of my hopes really are interrelated and intersect with Tala's and Kevin's and Ben's. My hope is that my research might be able to continue to shed light on and help us understand the ways in which we play a role in the way that narratives and stories are shaped, and that we as American Christians and as the church have a really big and important role to play in shifting the predominant narrative and narratives that exist in the church about Israel and about Palestine. Whether we think that we do or not, we are kind of in my diagram that I had of land and text and the arrows in between. Those, those kind of, that fusion does not happen with non-actors. There are real physical people that are a part of that kind of process. And I think that everyday folks like us are a part of that. We read the Bible, we, kind of make claims in our communities, we consume narratives, we support, whether we know it or not, particular organizations and particular efforts, that contribute to land annexation when we travel to the Holy Land. And so there are so many pieces involved in how we shape narratives and how we are actually, actively a part of what the land looks like and who has right to movement in it, who has access to education. And I think the church plays a big part in that. And I'm grateful that I got the scarf memo, Ben, for today. I prefer my scarves to be in between scarves and blankets. So happy Scarf Day to you all.
I have to go put mine on. I did not get the memo, but I didn't want to leave while you guys were presenting. So I think, just one of the thoughts I'm leaving with is, as each of you shared different elements of your research, we have not used the word intersectionality, but I feel like all of your research intersects in some way, shape, or form. And one of the questions, Jennifer manages our church partnerships as our outreach manager, and churches will often say, well, we don't have missions in the Middle East. Like, why would we go to the Holy Land? Or why would we travel to Egypt? Or why would we travel to Lebanon? And I think if we have an intersectional understanding that even if churches are not, considering the Middle East a part of the mission field, what happens there is as much a domestic issue as an international issue. And that the way we understand the world and the way we understand the Middle East and the way that we vote affects the lives of students, in Palestine, and of teachers and of visas. And that often when I first traveled to the Middle East, I found that Arabs in the Middle East paid more attention to American elections than the vast majority of Americans, because our policies and politics have such a deep impact on their life. And so I would encourage you, thank you so much for those who've joined us. If you have further questions, you can drop us a note at info@cmep.org. We can make sure it gets to our panelists. Tala is leaving us as a fellow, but is going to spend the next year finishing her dissertation. And she promised me after it's done, she will continue to speak on occasion for CMEP. So I wanted to just say that publicly, because that's what I heard. And so we'll encourage her and others in the finishing of their dissertations. And as they publish and as they're prolific, we want to celebrate and lift up their academic work as well. So thank you to each of you. Thank you for your work individually. Thank you for the ways that you support CMEP. I'm very proud and so really grateful for each of you. And thank you for everyone who joined us as well. Many blessings to you.